What's going on, bottom line viewers? It's Mitch here, and I have one question for you. Are you interested in winning your fantasy football league in 2020? I'm sure you are. And luckily for you, I have the answers to the test. I'm going to give you in this video the strategy that I'll be utilizing to win my fantasy football leagues and that you can utilize to help yourself bring home that fantasy football championship in 2020. Before I break down step by step my fantasy football strategy at every position throughout every round, make sure you do Gronk spike the like button and subscribe to the Bottom Line View for more fantasy football content just like this. Also, if you're interested in what I have to say about this fantasy football strategy, you can get my entire fantasy football draft board for the 2020 season that you can bring to your draft to dominate your draft if you subscribe to the Bottom Line View Patreon. It's $3 a month with that fantasy football draft board, along with Bottom Line View exclusive content, everything in the NFL. And it's only going to be ramping up with fantasy football season and the NFL season right around the corner. Let's get right into this fantasy strategy for 2020. Guys, this is my personal fantasy strategy. This is what I will be doing in my drafts. So, with that out of the way, let's just first talk about a couple of the things that I think you need to understand before you enter any fantasy draft, any fantasy league, before you pick any player. The first thing you need to understand, it's simple, but a lot of people overlook it, and it is the scoring system of your league. This matters a ton. This matters the rankings of the league, who you're going to pick, where in what round, what positions you want to target where, and ultimately how you're going to construct your team throughout the draft, as well as which players you want to favor over others within those same positions. Whether it's PPR, point per reception, half PPR, or it's standard, you need to know that. But beyond that, you also need to know if it's a super flex league, meaning 2-quarterback league, if gives more points to a certain position, like extra points to the tight end position. You need to know every roster spot inside and out. You need to know the scoring that goes along with that. And you also need to know a big one here is quarterback touchdown points. We'll get into why that's a big one with the quarterback position. Is it 4 for a passing touchdown? Is it 6 for a passing touchdown? That's also a big deal, in my opinion. The second thing you need to do before you even pick a player, you need to have a board. You need to have some sort of rankings with you, some sort of tier system, something that can structure your draft so that you're not panicking when you're on the clock. You should have multiple solutions at every round, every pick. You shouldn't be the guy at your draft that is panicking because his guy that he wanted was picked a pick ahead of him. You should never have that happen to you. You should always be ready with a solution, a backup plan, just like Bill Belichick with the Patriots. You need multiple backup plans. You need a backup plan to your backup plan. That is huge. And you also need this because you need to know where to hop on certain players, when to pick certain players, where you value certain players personally. And you could take into account different people that you trust, whether that's me or somebody else, and factor that all into your personal rankings, and then bring that to your draft to help you draft. When you're at draft day, you should be fully prepared. You should have your ranking set. You should have the players in mind that you want to draft. You shouldn't have much thinking to do because you've done all the research. You've done all the mock drafts. You've done all the prep. You've done all the research of what you want, and now that board is there to help you, just to guide you throughout the draft. Very smooth. And it should be that way as long as you have a draft board. And guys, if you're looking for a great draft board, again, I can't stress it enough. $3 a month, Bottom Line View, Patreon. This is the draft board that I'll be taking to every single one of my drafts that I'll be utilizing to help me win big fantasy leagues. So if you want my draft board, $3 a month. And it's not just the draft board, guys. There's a lot of stuff coming throughout the season that you're going to get on there. There's already a ton of exclusive content on Patreon. And the guys in the comments will tell you that it is an awesome community. The bottom line viewers, love you guys a lot. Now, the last thing I need to say before we get into specifics, into players, into positions, is roster construction. This is a thing that many fantasy experts will tell you is a big deal, but you need to understand it. Roster construction is a big deal to winning fantasy football because you can't have your entire team full of rookies. You can't have your entire team full of high floor but low ceiling players. You can't have all ceiling and no floor. You need to understand where to pick certain players. And then when you pick that player, how to pair that player with a different kind of player on your roster that will account for the weaknesses of that player. So if you're drafting a very high ceiling wide receiver, you want to partner that guy with a guy that's going to be week in, week out, very solid. Maybe not the same ceiling as him, but a very safe floor so that you can count on certain aspects of your roster, but you also know that you are going to win certain weeks if these players with the high ceiling that you drafted are going to go off. And we will talk more about this when we're constructing early and late round philosophy within your draft. And it all starts with the early round philosophy, the first couple of rounds. And really, I'm going to be honest with you, any person that plays fantasy football can have a successful round 1, round 2, round 3, and maybe even round 4. If they're just looking at basic rankings from any ESPN, Yahoo, it doesn't matter, expert, they're going to have a decent team and more than likely a pretty darn good team within the first 4 rounds, as long as they don't reach for anyone crazy in that first 4 rounds. They're going to have a good team. The Joe Schmo off the street will have a good team. It's more about getting past that point. But the important part to me in the early rounds is you want to not lose your draft. You don't want to lose your league in the first few rounds of that draft. You want to be probably leaning more towards safe in the first few rounds than risky. You want to be more towards the floor of players and less towards the ceiling of players. That does not mean you cannot be bold in your takes or your picks, but you need to do your own research and figure out the players that you really believe in, that you think are safe, but you think will give you a chance to win. So lean floor over ceiling in the early rounds. Lean safe, in other words, over risky in the first 2 to 4 rounds of your fantasy draft. That is my opinion. You don't want to be, in your first round of your draft, be picking somebody that you don't know what you're going to get from them. You need to be locked and loaded with that pick. That is your number one guy. That is the guy you're going to be carrying to a championship, more likely than not. Now, if you have a successful later of your draft, you're going to have an opportunity to carry other people to a championship. But that number one guy, he has to be good or you are not going to win the championship. He has to at least give you a floor, a certainty of production. That is for sure. Now, in specifics with the first couple of rounds, the early rounds, I have one little thing that I am going after each and every draft. And that is one of the top 14 running backs. I need to have one of the top 14 running backs on my team. Now, it doesn't have to be Christian McCaffrey. It doesn't have to be Ezekiel Elliott or Saquon Barkley. But as long as you have one of the top 14, which I think there's a significant drop-off after the number 14 running back, you are okay at the running back position. Now, something that I've noticed this year in particular over other years, in years past, I've been a little bit more, I'll say, value-based and a lot more balanced-based with my roster construction, meaning I'll take a lot of receivers, but also I'll balance it out with a fair amount of running backs early on. Maybe I'll go receiver, running back, or running back, receiver, receiver, or running back, receiver, receiver, running back, I would balance it out more likely than not. But I've found in 2020 that the teams that I have liked the most coming out of these mock drafts, these best ball drafts with, are the teams that are stacked at one position. So whether that's stacked at the running back position, meaning I'm spending most of my early round capital on the running back position 3 out of the 4 rounds, or I'm spending most of my capital on the receiver position in the first 3 or the first 4 rounds of your draft, I have felt personally, and this is the way I personally like to draft, is to stack a position loaded at receiver, loaded at running back. And I feel very confident in myself that I'm able to make up at the other position through my research, through my scouting, through my understanding of the NFL, through these players that I like, that I can make up at a deficiency, quote unquote deficiency. But in your mind, if you know that you can really pick a sleeper or somebody that you believe in, or maybe a couple guys that you're taking a shot at, and you know one of those guys is going to come through big, then it's not really, a risk so much. But it does give you an advantage over everyone else in the league, or at least most of the league, at one position. If you draft 3 running backs in the first 4 rounds, more than likely you're going to have one of the best running back stables in your league. If you have 3 receivers in the first 4 rounds, you're more than likely going to have one of the best receiver stables in your league. A couple things within this. You need to understand the roster makeup of your league. So is your league a quarterback, 1 quarterback, 2 quarterbacks? Is your league 2 running backs that you need to start, 3 running backs you need to start, maybe a flex and 2 running backs? Is it 3 receivers and a flex? Is it 3 receivers, a flex, 2 running backs? What is the makeup of your starting roster in your league? Because that also changes the way that you want to stack your roster. More often than not, rosters right now in fantasy leagues are 3 receivers, 2 running backs, and a flex. That's more often than not. Sometimes it's 3 receivers and 2 running backs. Sometimes it's 2 running backs, 2 receivers, and a flex. It just depends on the format of the league. So make sure you understand that going into your draft, and then you can draft the way you want based on that. Now, I would say if it's 2 receivers that you need to start with the flex, I'd probably lean going running back heavy. If it's 3 receivers and a flex, I would lean going wide receiver heavy. It really depends what you have to draft, because typically the receiver position obviously is way deeper in fantasy football. So I know that a lot of people out there are telling a lot of other people to go running back heavy early on. But it really depends how the others are drafting in your league. If everyone's taking running backs, that is where I switch my strategy. I'm going to take receivers. It's as simple as that. It's just up to the value. And I let what other people are doing dictate where I'm going to go with the draft, and therefore have the advantage on everyone else, because if everyone is zigging, I'm going to zag. But it's up to you to be confident enough to do that. So it's a very value-based strategy. It's also super important to understand what pick you have, right? If you have the first or second pick, Christian McCaffrey, Saquon Barkley, or I'd throw in the third pick, which more likely than not is going to be Zeke, maybe Alvin Kamara. Okay, these guys, I would say you are more likely, at least I am more likely, to go receiver heavy after I pick one of these studs, because I understand that I have a running back that can carry the load at that position. But if I'm later in the draft, I'm more likely to go, say it's a 10 or a 12 team league. If I'm at pick 10 and a 10, or if I'm 12 and a 12, I'm more likely to go running back, because I understand that, okay, I'm not getting a Saquon, I'm not getting a McCaffrey. I can make up receiver later, but I'm going to pick my running backs at the end of the draft, 2 guys that I really like. Let's say, whether that's Clyde Edwards-Helaire or Nick Chubb or Derrick Henry or whoever it is within those top 14 that you like, select Joe Mixon, whoever it is, right? Select those guys. Receiver position wise, I'm more lenient just based on my mock drafts and based on how this offseason has gone and my drafting so far and what I've liked best in terms of results. I've found most often when I go running back in the top 3 picks, if I have a top 3 pick or top 4 pick, and then I go receivers later, unless one of those top 14 running backs slides to me, I'm going to take as many of those guys as I possibly can, because I understand that there's only so limited amount of those guys. But if those guys are not there, or especially if I'm picked 2, I'm not picking for a long time. So I'm more likely to pick up an elite receiver that I feel is a top 10, a number 1 caliber receiver for fantasy, whoever that is. And the important thing in the middle rounds is how you follow up your strategy. So if you're going to follow this stack strategy, it's not necessarily 0 RB or 0 receiver because you're taking at least 1 player within the first 4 rounds. But it depends on how you're going to follow that up. And you really want to target the players that you like in certain rounds. And what I've noticed is if I am running back light and I end up going an upper echelon running back, say I'm pick 1 and I have McCaffrey and I picked 3 receivers in a row because I love McCaffrey, there's a good opportunity for me to go receiver again and have that flex spot filled out with my 3 stud receivers and a top running back. And then basically what I'm trying to find is I'm just going to take dart shots at that second running back position for 3 rounds straight and just throw mid-rounders at that spot, whether that's DeAndre Swift or another rookie like Cam Akers, or high upside options, or maybe lower upside but high floor options that you can count on, maybe like a Le'Veon Bell if he drops, or David Johnson if he falls, somebody like that. It really depends on your preference there. Typically, you want to go with, okay, maybe I want to go with a floor guy, and then I want to go with a ceiling guy. Again, back to roster construction. Ultimately, this decision of whether you're going to fade the running back position or fade the receiver position has to be made with your second pick. That's what I would say. Based on how the second round falls to you, you need to make your decision. Am I stacking at running backs? Am I stacking at receivers? And then ultimately, you're making the best value decision for your team each and every round, but understanding that once you make that decision, and if you decide to stack one position, you need to follow that stack up with dart throws, just absolute dart throws at players that you think have high upside. As I mentioned, the mid rounds are very important for filling up the position that you faded. But even more so is the later rounds. The late rounds, I typically have stacked early on. I've fulfilled the fade, let's say, in the middle rounds. And then in the later rounds, I'm taking the dart throws at just players that I think have high upside. The late rounds are all about upside. I'm not drafting anybody that I do not think can be a superstar. I think has a big time opportunity to become a number 1 running back, a number 1 receiver, a number 1 tight end, a number 1 quarterback. I'm not taking anyone that I think is deemed safe. Now, if I went super upside early on for whatever reason, although I said do not do that, tend to go safe early on, then maybe you want to throw in a safer player, right? Maybe you want to throw in a Jamison Crowder instead of a Slayton at receiver if you have riskier receivers early on. Maybe at receiver in the middle rounds, because you faded the receiver position, maybe you went DK Metcalf and DJ Chark 2 rounds in a row, and you know that those guys have super high ceilings, but they also have very interesting floors. And don't get lazy with the later rounds either. The later rounds win you your draft. Believe it or not, like I said, the first round, you don't want to lose your draft, but the later rounds, you can win your draft. Last year, I picked Lamar Jackson in as many leagues as I possibly could. I would have picked him in more if other people didn't just snag him right ahead of me. And more often than not, I was correct on Lamar Jackson last year. He was the MVP of the league. I did the same thing with Mark Andrews at tight end. Quarterback and tight end, which is a good segue into these positions, are very similar positions. And I have a specific strategy for both, which is a very common strategy. I am more than likely a late round quarterback kind of guy. I almost never pick a quarterback until the 6th or 7th round at the very earliest, to be honest with you. And I know a lot of people say take the value at quarterback even if it's early, but I just bypass it because I don't want that. And I personally have confidence that I can find a quarterback or a tight end that I feel strongly in that they can break out. Last year was Lamar Jackson. Tight end was Mark Andrews. The quarterback position sweet spot in this year's fantasy landscape is rounds 8 through rounds 11. There are 5 quarterbacks in this range that I like a lot, and I'll be leaving most of my drafts with. Tom Brady, who's currently going in the 8th round. Matthew Stafford, who's going in the 10th round. Josh Allen, whose ADP is at the 9th round. Cam Newton, who's also going in the 10th round. And Daniel Jones, who's going in the 11th round. These 5 quarterbacks are the quarterbacks that I feel have a fair ceiling along with being relatively safe. There is one quarterback, though, that is going a little bit higher than these guys that I'm willing to take in the 7th round, and that's Deshaun Watson. Deshaun Watson is a quarterback that's going in this weird sweet spot of like being the last of the elite group of quarterbacks that I deem to be elite that are going like late 6th round. And I've seen in many drafts, because a lot of the players that want to go quarterback middle to early rounds have already selected their guy, Watson is the guy that kind of slides down the board and ends up being in a spot where he falls to the 7th, he falls to the even 8th round at times, and you can scoop him up in that range if you like him. Now, I like Watson. I'll get into the reason specifically why in my quarterback rankings in my quarterback tiers, but that is the only guy I'm kind of willing, because he's the only guy that I really see that falls. Now, sometimes Russell Wilson will fall into that range. So really it's Watson and maybe sometimes Russell Wilson. It really depends on the website you're playing on or what platform you're on. It really does depend on those rankings and how people are selecting the quarterback position throughout your draft. And you also have to adjust your expectations and where you're going to pick a quarterback based on how other people are picking quarterbacks. If everyone else is waiting on a quarterback, if it's the 5th round and Patrick Mahomes is still there, then pick Patrick Mahomes. Obviously, there comes a point for everybody, which is what I'm going to talk about with the tiers and the rankings. But more often than not, I'm saying in a realistic world, that's not going to happen. But when I do my tier videos, I'm going to give you the round that I'd select each quarterback in and why and where I have each player and the rankings in the order that I have them. And in the draft board, I'll go over it specifically player by player, even in more depth, and you'll have a layout of every player in each round and where you should select them as well. So make sure you do subscribe to the Patreon to get that draft board. So those are the quarterbacks I really like. And in a strategy that I tend to go with quarterbacks, I've done this over the last, I want to say 2 to 3 years, is I really like to pair quarterbacks because I don't like to pick an early quarterback, which means, okay, I'm not leaving with a Mahomes. I'm not leaving with Lamar. I'm not leaving with maybe Dak you would throw in there or anyone like that. So I'm not leaving with those guys, which means I'm more than likely not going to just have one quarterback on my roster. More often than not, I actually like to pick 2 quarterbacks in my draft. But specifically, there's a reason to this. Now, I like to pick 2 quarterbacks that I think pair with each other quite well. So whether that means one has a high ceiling and one is a pretty safe player. So you could pair Matt Stafford, who's relatively safe, with a Cam Newton, who has a huge ceiling, but it's also really risky. Or a Tom Brady, who's very safe. I also think has a pretty high ceiling this year. But you could pair him with Daniel Jones, for example. I like to pair quarterbacks together. I would even go Tom Brady and Matt Stafford just because I like them, depending on where they're going. But I feel like that is the best way to go because you can solidify that if you feel 2 of guys are on the board in a range that you deem acceptable to pick a quarterback, and they're both there, then solidify getting a quarterback one. Solidify getting a top 12 quarterback for this season. And this most often works with a guy like Cam or a guy like Daniel Jones because they have super high ceilings, but they also are risky. So they're a guy that could end up being top 5 in fantasy. Josh Allen could be top 1, but he's going in the 9th round, right? So these players, you gotta weigh the ceiling versus the floor, and I would say pair 2 quarterbacks together within the 8th to the 11th round. Within these rounds as well, most of the receivers and the running backs that are top tier and starters are going to be gone. And more often than not, your receiver position is going to be filled, at least your starting positions, and your running back starters are going to be filled. So now it's time to find your quarterback, in my opinion. Now, you can still fill up your bench perfectly fine, but sometimes I just like to go after those 2 quarterbacks. If 2 out of those 5 are still there in a range that I like within this range, then I don't mind going back-to-back quarterbacks. And the same thing can be said about the tight end position. I don't mind going back-to-back quarterbacks in the 9th and 10th or the 10th and 11th. I don't mind going back-to-back tight ends, right? I don't mind it at all. Now, it depends where you pick your first tight end. And for the sweet spot for the tight end position, I see it as the 5th round and on. I'm willing to pass on Kittle and Kelsey because I don't want to pick a tight end there when I only have to start 1 per week. Again, I like to find the diamond in the rough, and I understand that I'm not always going to find that player, but I'm willing to bet that I can find at least one. And this year, in 2020, there are a lot of diamonds in the rough out there that I feel are pretty interesting. And that is why I actually really like the pairing strategy at the tight end position this year. Because maybe I'll go with somebody that I think is a little safer and a little bit more mid-round quality. And then I'll go with a later round guy that has huge potential. Maybe he can be a top 10 tight end in the NFL this year, but we just haven't seen it yet. So the pairing strategy for tight end, I think, is even more warranted than the quarterback position. Because quarterback, you can pick up a guy probably in your league and still be able to start him who doesn't get drafted at all. Quarterback is more specific to how much you like the players. Tight end is just you need to do it because, man, if you're not getting that stud tight end, you need 2. And you just need to see which one breaks out because one of them is going to break out. The odds go up drastically if you take 2 and not just 1 tight end. So to me, round 5 on. Now, why do I say round 5 on? Because there's a lot of mid-round tight ends this year that I really like, that I think are super safe, that a lot of people are sleeping on. Zach Ertz is reliable. I understand Zach Ertz is not Kelsey, he's not Kittle. But those guys are going in round 2. I can get Zach Ertz in round 5. And with a healthy Carson Wentz, he's the number 1 receiver in that offense. Darren Waller, same thing. Number 1 receiver, number 1 go-to guy in the Raiders offense. He's an awesome player. I think he had like 1,100 yards last year. He's a great add in the 5th round. Evan Ingram is a player that goes way later than he should. I think the 8th, sometimes the late 7th. He's a player I'm willing to pick at that spot because I think he has a high ceiling to finish in the top 5. All of these guys do. The guy that I really love is Tyler Higbee. Now, I might be spoiling this for some people, but Tyler Higbee, I think, is going to be an absolute monster this year. I think he's going to be a stud. And he is going in the 8th round. He's the guy that I probably am going to leave most drafts with. He's the guy in the mid rounds that I'm willing to take the most because he's going the latest, but he also has a really high ceiling. There are a lot of late round guys, though. If you don't feel comfortable with the mid round tight end strategy, there are a lot of late round guys. And even if you do pick one of these mid round guys, it's worth it to pick one of these late round guys just because of the potential that they offer. Last year in one of my leagues, I totally missed on OJ Howard. Okay, totally missed on him. Willing to accept that. But I picked Mark Andrews 4 rounds later, and it ended up not really mattering. I guess it hurt my team in the long run because I could have picked a receiver there or whatever, but I still went with Mark Andrews, so it saved me at the tight end position, and I was able to make some trades, maneuver my roster, get rid of OJ Howard, and get somebody else in there at a position that I needed. So maybe it's trade bait. Maybe it's just trying to find that diamond. But there are a lot of guys. I think Mike Gesicki is one that I'd throw out there as a guy that I think's rising every single day. Noah Fant, TJ Hawkinson, 2 first-round stud tight ends with opportunity in their offense. I would even say a guy like, a lot of people love Hayden Hurst, who's going to be the 3rd option in Atlanta. He's going a little higher for my liking, in my opinion. Then you look at Jonnu Smith, who has all the athletic ability in the world, who could be the number 2 option in that passing game. Eric Ebron, who could be a touchdown monster, especially if you're in like a standard league. He's a good option late. So all of these guys, and even at Jack Doyle, who could be Phillip Rivers' number 2 target in the passing game this year in Indianapolis, all of these guys are going way late in your drafts that you can pick up. So if you're going mid-round, or if you're just going to go too late, pick your strategy. I would say if you miss out on one of those mid-round guys, then make sure you get 2 of these guys. But I would go 1 mid-round if I can, in a good spot with good value, and then 1 later on. That's my opinion, but I'm good either way. If I miss out on Higbee, if I miss out on Ingram, if I miss out on one of those guys, I'm perfectly cool just picking 2 late-round guys that I like and just going with that for week 1 and just going with the best matchup early on, waiting for the guy to break out, and then riding that guy to the championship. Perfectly cool with that. The last thing I gotta say for this fantasy strategy for 2020 is do not draft a defense early. Please do not. Do not draft a kicker early. Do not draft them until the last 2 rounds of your draft. And sometimes you don't even need to. Check with your commissioner if you need to draft them early. And do not draft multiple kickers. Do not draft multiple defenses because of a bye week. Do not do that. That's a rookie move. Do not do it. It's not worth it. Stream your defenses. Unless you have the New England Patriots 2019 defense from last year, don't do it. Right? Now, a couple tips is I wouldn't even pick a kicker if I didn't need to. So make sure you check with your commissioner, because you can easily just pick one up later, on Sunday at 4 Eastern after the first slate of games. You could pick that extra rookie that maybe he breaks out in that first section of games, and then pick up your kicker later on, and you can release whoever you want to release, right? And a tip for the defense, for picking your defense, would be if you're one of the last guys to pick a defense, just pick the defense that you feel strongest in week 1. If they have a good matchup in week 1, pick that defense. Now, I'll be providing you with kicker rankings or a kicker and defense video at some point before your fantasy draft. If you guys have any questions, leave them in the comments. If you have any specific videos you'd like me to do, and I think they're pretty cool, then maybe I'll do them. Make sure you do get that draft board. Subscribe to the Patreon, the Bottom Line View Patreon, in the description below. Fantasy season is here, guys. I hope this strategy, if you're going to do it, if you're not, doesn't matter. Just hopefully you learn something. That's all I really am hoping for. If you did learn something, Gronk spike the like button. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the Bottom Line View for more NFL and fantasy content just like this. It's Mitch. Peace.